We will deliver our commitment to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, but we will bring it forward so that we reach that level in 2027.
I was quite shocked by this, Gordon. I mean, I know that it had been pitch-rolled, as we say in the trade, that he was going to up defence spending, but did we expect this announcement now? Let's go through the figures on it, because it's quite a substantial spending commitment at a time when Rachel Reeves has been banging on endlessly about £22 billion black holes.
Yes. Well, we didn't expect it because we don't really expect Keir Starmer to do anything very quickly once he's talked about it. Up until now, he was saying he wanted to increase defence spending, but he wasn't even putting a date on it. And all of a sudden, he's sort of snapped his heels together and actually done something.
Yes. Who would have thought it? Shock horror. Prime Minister in doing something shock. 13.4 billion extra on defence spending every year until 2027. Then a commitment to spending 3% on defence in the next Parliament, saying that he will do that, again, it's a shock horror moment, by reducing the foreign aid budget from 0.5% of GDP to 0.3%. What would David Cameron think? How can this lefty politician be abandoning his international commitments, Gordon? But this is the Trump effect, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is. It feels as though we're in a moment of sort of world history that is being played out on day by day, such that we haven't really seen, probably in our lifetimes. It's quite hard to get your head around the sort of magnitude of what's going on at the moment, isn't it? You've got, as we mentioned, these astonishing things happening at the UN where Russia and America and North Korea and Belarus are ganging up on Europe,
Yes.
which is pretty scary. You've got Emmanuel Macron talking about putting French nuclear weapons in Germany. You've got Keir Starmer now being asked about whether Britain will put nuclear weapons in Germany. Something that hasn't been the case since the early 90s. And I guess the question is, to what extent is Donald Trump being serious about these things that he keeps talking about, like pulling out of Europe, like the end of NATO, which the German Chancellor-to-be is talking about? And to what extent is this all just a sort of negotiating position that Trump is using to shock the world into, well, for example, increasing defence spending in Europe?
But it's having an effect, isn't it? I mean, Starmer now goes to Washington, meets Trump in the White House, being able to say, I have listened, I have acted. I mean, we weren't really on the naughty step with the rest of the European Union on the whole issue of defence spending, really. I think there's an acknowledgement that the UK has done quite well at keeping its end up. But this commitment now strengthens his hand as he goes to the US. He's going to have a pretty successful meeting because Macron's done quite the merry dance. What do we make of handshake off? I want to ask you as a man, because what's the significance of this holding on to someone else's hand for longer? Is there some male thing going on here? What is it?
Not that I'm aware of, but I guess we're talking about Trump, and Trump is not a normal person, is he? I think what's happening is that Macron is a very charming man. He's got a big personality, and I think that the danger for Keir Starmer is that Keir Starmer turns up on a Thursday. You've had Macron standing up to Trump, saying you're wrong about Ukraine being the aggressor. You're wrong about Europe getting its money back that it's put into Ukraine, and getting away with it because he's so charming. Keir Starmer is not particularly charming, and he turns up in America on Thursday, having given away the Chagos Islands, or he wants to. So this whole thing about increasing defence spending almost seems like a sort of panic move to try to get on the right side of Trump ahead of a meeting which could have been very, very awkward and probably still will be.
Why didn't he say, that's a really good point politically, Starmer could have said, we're going to spend more money on defence because we're not paying Mauritius to take islands that we already own. Farage claims that the amount of money we're going to spend over the next 99 years on this ridiculous deal is 52 billion. I don't know. The Prime Minister himself hasn't denied the 18 billion figure that's been put to him, not once but twice at PMQs. So that would have been a more sensible strategy. But he's still going to be quite warmly welcomed by Trump, isn't he, because of this defence spending commitment. So it is a rare piece of shrewd politics from him, isn't it?
Well, we won't know until he turns up there, because Trump obviously wants to, he says we should spend 5% of GDP on defence. And we obviously had Boris Johnson telling the Telegraph on Monday that it should be 3% now, not in a few years' time. Now, Boris Johnson is someone who knows Trump very well. He knows Ukraine very well. He's still a hero there. He knows Zelensky very well. Boris Johnson's position on this is that Trump says 5%. What he really means is if you go to 3%, I'll be happy with that. So it feels as though Keir Starmer could have gone a little bit further even than he has. But, as Kemi Badenoch said today, and we'll get onto this, when she was in government, 3% was being talked about, but she said they couldn't make the numbers work. So this is a very difficult proposition that Keir Starmer is now committing to. Well, we did have this amazing moment when Macron fact-checked the president live on TV as they were talking in the press conference about whether America could be compensated financially for the aid they've given to Ukraine. Should we listen to that?
Europe is loaning the money to Ukraine. They get their money back.
No, in fact, to be frank, we paid 60% of the total effort, and it was through, like the US, loans, guarantee, grants, and we provided real money, to be clear.
And Trump didn't look very keen on Macron's decision to do that.
No, his face was somewhat of a picture. Then we have this bizarre situation with handshakes. They've got a history, these two, with handshaking and holding on to each other's hands. And one of them doesn't want to relinquish the hand first because it's a sign of weakness. Seriously, Gordon, is this a male thing or is this just a world leader thing? What's gone on there?
Well, I mean, Macron's French. They like to kiss people a lot, including men. We don't do that here. Trump is someone who is big on handshakes. He has this whole thing about how you can sort of best your negotiating opponent by doing things like not washing your hands after you've been to the loo. So
What?
there's a in his book, he talks about you can get a psychological advantage on your opponent by going to the loo, not washing your hands. You shake hands, you've sort of left your germs on them, and then that sets you up psychologically because you feel you've got one over on them.
Oh my
So there's a
God.
lot of stuff going on in those handshakes.
The art of the deal becomes the art of the loo. Well, let's talk about Kemi, because I'm trying to work out now. She gives this keynote speech at the Policy Exchange at 10:30, only to get into Parliament to see Keir Starmer basically doing what she's advocated, but he's come out with it too quickly for her to claim it as a victory. Because this is what you have to do in opposition.
Yeah.
You have to be looking to be pushing the government to a position and then saying, oh, he's increased defence spending because I called for it. She can't. He's increasing defence spending because Trump has called for it.
Yeah, I mean, if you're in opposition, the nature of the job is that the government nicks all your best ideas, and you just have to swallow it, really. But as you say, there wasn't time for her speech to sort of sink in or even for people to really be aware of it before Starmer had effectively superseded it by saying, here's what we're going to do.
Maybe the speech was badly timed. We arrived there this morning, didn't we? 1 Old Queen Street, right in the middle of Westminster. We're next door to the National Farmers Union conference, which we'll talk about in a bit. Tractors are outside beeping and hooting as they would. They've been doing this since the IHT changes were announced by Labour. She then starts speaking. She gets a bit drowned out. However, I don't want to take away from her the fact that this was a pretty solid speech.
Yeah. We both turned up this morning, didn't we? And we were slightly worried that it might be underwhelming, partly because the overnight trail that they'd put out of the speech was a little bit dull.
Yeah, it was dry.
It was about the ECHR, and it felt a little bit off the pace and a little bit sort of inward-looking, given everything else that's going on. But actually, she kicked off the speech very well, and she made some very good, punchy points about where we are at the moment in relation to our relationship with America. And I thought she sounded a lot more bullish than Starmer.
That others, even friends, will ultimately put themselves first. And before the inevitable pearl clutching of those who wish it was still 1995, none of this is a selfish objective. We have lived off the inheritance of Thatcher, Reagan, and Gorbachev for far too long. Just look at how the ECHR redefined climate protection as a human right, or at the overreach in the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice and the ruling of the International Tribunal for the Law on the Sea on Chagos. or at the UN rapporteurs touring the world claiming that the West is racist and discriminatory when we clearly are not. If international bodies are taken over by activists or by autocratic regimes like China and Russia, we must use our influence to stop them. And if that fails, we will need to disengage. Young people can no longer be taught to dislike our country, our institutions, and our history so much that they say they wouldn't fight for it. Over the last 20 years, the ECHR rulings morphed so fundamentally that they now limit our ability to control our borders or even fight in wars. And as Dean said earlier, policy exchange has exposed over the last decade in work covering the ICC, lawfare against our armed forces, and the Labour government's surrender of our territory in Chagos. We cannot win a war against an opponent willing to break all the rules while we insist on playing by the most gentle of Queensberry rules.
I did quite like what she said, Gordon, particularly from a Conservative perspective, about this idea that we're all far too nostalgic about the Thatcher, Reagan, Gorbachev era, and we need to move on. I thought that was quite a mature acknowledgement, particularly for people on the right who are fearful about this new world order. She was trying to be quite patriotic, and she gave this other line as well, didn't she, about this idea that defending the national interest is primary to any other policy, which is putting out your stall in a quite hawkish way. I mean, was it strong enough in its rhetoric?
Yeah, I thought that she was telling it how it is in a way that certainly Starmer and others have not really done yet. I worry that there's a danger that leaders can't quite get their head round what's going on. They can't make that leap of imagination to the world that we could be living in very soon. They think that, oh, it'll all be fine. We've always had America on our side. They're not going to side with Russia. Nothing's going to change that much. Well, the signs are that it may well change an awful lot. There's been a lot of comparisons in the last few days and weeks to the 1930s. We've had people talking about how America is effectively appeasing Russia by allowing it to keep the land it's taken. We've had people warning that if Trump goes ahead with that plan, he may be leaving the door open to Putin invading Ukraine again in a couple of years' time, or even another European country. And I think, and Kemi Badenoch was talking today about the need to rearm. It did remind me a bit of Churchill before the Second World War. I'm not saying she's Churchill, but it's that same concept that, people are not quite grasping the reality of the situation. We need to rearm. We need to be ready. And this is what she said.
2.5% by 2030 is now no longer sufficient. We must rebuild and go further and faster. Rebuilding will be achieved by having a plan to rearm based on an efficient, focused military, equipped with and trained to use the new kinds of weapons we have seen deployed to devastating effect in Ukraine. We also need to be honest enough to admit that military procurement still needs a fundamental redesign to be faster, more responsive, and deliver better value for taxpayers. The message should be simple. We must do what it takes to protect Britain. That means not just our independent nuclear deterrent, but also the ability to protect critical national infrastructure at home and under the sea. It means having the capability required to contribute meaningfully to NATO-led deterrence in Europe. Alongside this, we need to make sure that we have the infrastructure to keep Britain strong. We cannot put virtue signalling ahead of a realistic assessment of our national interest. That means prioritizing our energy security, building our domestic R&D capabilities in key technologies of the future, such as uncrewed vehicles, while learning the lessons of Ukraine that our conventional ground strength still matters. It means defending industries vital to our resilience, including arms manufacturing. So we should not be suspending arms licenses to our allies on spurious political grounds.
The other thing about Kemi's speech, I thought, was it was sort of sensible and pragmatic and what I would suggest is sort of competent conservatism, as opposed to some of the rhetoric perhaps that we've heard from Reform, although we haven't heard that much, let's be honest, from Nigel Farage and co.
No.
Reform were criticised for being absent from David Lammy's statement on Monday about the third anniversary of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. They're in a difficult position because we know that they have sided with a more Trumpian stance on Putin. So she's trying to quite carefully and I think quite cleverly and strategically look like she is the sensible face of the right.
Yes.
Reform want to say she's the wet face of the right,
Yeah.
with all of this talk from Farage about, oh, well, they're not even conservatives. She's clearly a conservative, but she's trying to be stateswoman-like.
Yeah, and I agree with you. And I think the main problem is anybody listening?
True.
As we said before, the timing of this speech maybe could have been better. There's so much else going on. Will this all just be drowned out? Will people even have heard it?
When it comes to these UN resolutions that the US has sided with Russia on seemingly and some of our other enemies, and this whole nuclear situation, I mean, how worried are you about all this?
I'm pretty worried. I mean, I'm not going to lie. We were talking this morning, weren't we, about the fact that the Ministry of Defence this week had to put out a statement sort of explaining when and where and how Britain might launch nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
I can't remember that ever happening before
No.
in the time I've been working. So I found that very worrying to begin with. I do find it worrying that we are now in a situation where we are having to have discussions about whether Britain deploys some sort of nuclear weapons in Germany, should the Americans sort of scale down or even pull out of their European presence. And, it does feel like a sort of a generational moment, potentially. We had the Second World War, then we had the Cold War. This almost feels like we could be entering a moment of that magnitude in terms of reshaping the way the world looks.
Do you know what worries me about it as well is, like, I think people are looking at Trump and thinking that he is playing some really complex game of chess where he's looking 8 moves ahead because he's going to preempt that Putin's going to do this, that and the other. And I think that's really dangerous because I'm not sure whether he necessarily has the capacity to be looking at what other people are doing 8 steps ahead, because he's so focused on his own role in the world order. It's like this idea, oh, well, no, actually, because he's going to pull some rabbit out of the hat further down the line. It's like, no, he's really just focusing on his own interests and America's interests, having been successfully elected on a basis of America first. That literally does mean the rest of the Western world comes second to his own personal interests and his own political interests. I don't think people are kind of like attributing a bit too much sort of altruism to him. Like, this guy is transactional.
Yeah.
He's quite willing to, as long as he's all right, he's quite willing to see Europe, the Ukrainians and the rest of us swing. I think, or am I?
No, I agree with you. And that's one of the things I mean when I say I worry that some of the European leaders can't make that leap of imagination, that an American president would effectively just say, well, you're on your own.
Yes.
I also worry a bit that, I haven't seen any evidence of this, but I wonder if this is part of what's going on, that European leaders could well be thinking, well, Trump's only there for 4 years. There'll be a different president in 4 years' time, may well be a Democrat, and things might just get back to normal. And I think that's very dangerous if that is the way they're thinking, because within the next 4 years, Russia could do all sorts of things.
Yeah.
And
emboldened Russia.
Yeah. And also, there's no guarantee that the next president will be J.D. Vance, who might pursue exactly the same policies. So I think Europe has to sort of, put a flag in the sand now and say, this is what we're going to do. And we're not going to rely on some possible future change of regime in America.
And also this idea, Putin won't be around forever. And if we carve out 20% of Ukrainian territory now in order to reach a peace deal in Ukraine, things might change if he's toppled. What?
Well,
because the next Russian president's going to be giving land back. It doesn't seem to make much sense.
And then we're back to the 1930s again, aren't we? The idea that if you just let him have this, then he'll stop. Well, he won't, will he?